All right, thank you. Thanks for carving out some time for this in your busy meeting. As I've introduced already, my name is Joe, and me and my project partner, Megan Sylvia, we're both master students in the Environmental Studies program at Antioch. So yeah, we're gonna spend about a little over 10 minutes or so kind of giving you the background of our project, and then our hope is to hear from you all. So just a little overview of the agenda. We're going to look at a general overview of our research so far, because the project is not complete. We'll start with the background information, kind of lay the framework of our project, and then go into our findings. So we'll offer key takeaways of migration trends, both nationally and more specifically to our region. We're going to even dive into some of the specific indicators we've looked at since COVID started. Then we'll share out how these migration patterns impact both ecological and social systems within this study area. And then we're going to wrap it all up, share our upcoming steps for the project, and then that's where we'll start our discussion with you all. Next slide.
Okay, so recently, reports in various articles have started to indicate that New Hampshire and Vermont may be more resilient than other regions of the country to climate change. So this project is a partnership, as we discussed, between Antioch University and Connecticut River Joint Commissions, and it explores the Connecticut River Valley area, as Olivia mentioned, and whether it's becoming a climate haven. And we're doing that by identifying current and anticipated population trends and the interconnected impacts, with a particular focus on watershed health and social equity. In addition to identifying anticipated population trends and impacts, the project team will highlight ideal planning strategies to enable a resilient and just response to in-migration.
Soon realized, however, that the scope of migration we're interested in included that from COVID, as well as current social shifts. So we decided to call the broader concept of migration disturbance migration. With the exception of extreme disasters, determining the cause of a current migration is often impossible, and most often the interconnected nature of climate, economic, and social shifts inhibit the identification of a primary influencer for someone's migration. So rather than attempting to discern the exact cause of the migration we're currently seeing and projecting for the future, we're assessing trends of migration in accordance with both current and future disturbance scenarios. So this includes, but isn't limited to, climate migration, pandemic migration, political refuge, and economic recessions. So disturbance migration, it results in both affinity migration and forced migration. So affinity migration is when populations with ample resources are able to move proactively from a non-ideal living environment to a more ideal living environment. So an example of that is what we're seeing with the relocation of high-risk people from high-risk transmission areas during COVID into more low transmission areas. In contrast, a forced migration is often made by people who don't have the opportunity to plan ahead and therefore have to move last minute, often against their preferences to escape what is perceived or could possibly actually be a mortal threat. Okay, next slide. So let's look at some historical migration trends. When we look at migration from a national scale, several historic trends are clear. First off, marginalized communities settled in vulnerable areas such as wetlands, and this is often due to being pushed out of areas that were more hospitable by a more dominant demographic. So a second trend that is apparent is the different migration patterns associated with acute versus chronic disturbances. So with an acute disturbance, this is something, say, like a hurricane or a pandemic could fall into that depending on how long it lasts. For these, migration is often temporary and short distance, so moving within relative close proximity to where you're from. With a chronic disturbance, migration is more apt to be long-term or even permanent, and then you're more likely to move a longer distance. Regardless of whether it's acute or chronic, though, migrants prefer to relocate to regions in which they possess interpersonal ties with existing community members. So all of those factors combine to create a migration system, and this system has repetitive flows of in-migration and out-migration between communities. So for example, our study area has these repetitive flows between Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania. And that Northeast corridor is what's largely going to define our migration system for this project. So with that, let's kind of jump into this study area along the Connecticut River Valley. New Hampshire and Vermont, they're characterized by a predominantly white population. As of 2010, Vermont was 97% white. And this history of a large white population is largely due, as we know, to white colonization of New England, followed by slavery, and then what is manifesting as interpersonal and systemic racism, reducing Black property ownership in the region. So while Black history in the North is only recently being discovered and shared as an accurate component of the region's history, despite cultural rhetoric depicting New England as a historically white homogenous community, Black populations have resided in the state since the beginning of slavery in the US. So one of the largest influxes of migration since then has occurred after the decline of farming populations. So if you all remember, kind of an out-migration from farms, more significantly in Vermont than New Hampshire, but across both states. As a response, there were statewide initiatives to repopulate those working farms. And that was focused on recruiting primarily European migrant workers as well. So flash forward, we're going to look at the start of this 21st century. Some of the more recent historic trends is that there's been a decline in Vermont residents, specifically middle age, so between the 35 to 54 range. In general, Vermont residents possess higher levels of education than the national average, with higher percentages of high school graduates, bachelor degrees, and graduate degrees than that national average. But even so, a significant proportion of individuals with those higher degrees choose to migrate out of the states. And on the next slide, we'll kind of see how some of these patterns and that brain drain manifest today. We can go to the next slide.
Thanks, Jo. So looking at regional modern migration trends, you see that Vermont is experiencing a decline in population as people leave for employment and higher wages. Seniors are becoming the largest population demographic. Migration within the state is trending toward the Burlington area. Nearly half of in-migration is attributed to international refugees. Domestic in-migration includes people with higher degrees and larger incomes than the established population, which can create tensions within communities. New Hampshire, on the other hand, is experiencing an increase in population from in-migration. People are relocating primarily to the metropolitan parts of New Hampshire for employment, higher wages, taxes, and the economy. They are generally a younger demographic than the established population. Based on studies conducted in New Hampshire and Vermont, characteristics that influence people to relocate to the area include family connections, the landscape and natural amenities, small town feel, and in some cases, the employment and the economy. The graph shows that the CRJC area is experiencing some of these same migratory patterns that are represented at the state level. So you can see on the chart that New Hampshire has an increasing population, whereas Vermont study area has a decreasing population. You know, we looked at COVID-19 trends to the best of our abilities. I think everyone is probably familiar with the headlines like, you know, school enrollment increases as families move to Vermont and New Hampshire, or low inventory drives high demand in the real estate market. And, as more hikers explore the mountains, calls for help and trash on trails increase. We saw these articles, we read these articles, we heard, about these experiences. We researched, the migratory changes and impacts through social, economic, and environmental indicators. And these indicators included population, school enrollment, housing, recreational changes. At this time, the data for the area is inconclusive, and we were unable to discern changes from normal fluctuation, although more statewide data is now just becoming available. So these may be, indicators that in another year or two sort of reflect, I think, what some of the different communities are experiencing better. We also did not gain insight on whether the pandemic influenced migrants are seeking short-term refuge in Vermont and New Hampshire or permanent residency. So that is still out there. School enrollment data may become a valuable indicator of some of the migratory changes. However, our historic New Hampshire school enrollment data did not align with the 10-year population change. And so I think a deeper dive would have to go on there to understand that data a little better before it becomes a valuable indicator. The IRS data is available. They have databases with migration inflows and outflows, and that shows to be promising, a promising indicator, but the most recent data available is from 2017. So again, it's going to be a few years before data, on 2020 is going to be available. We looked at ecological impacts of population growth and development related to disturbance migration. Here we have lists of terrestrial ecosystem and watershed health impacts. As previously discussed, the natural amenities are a draw to the area, influencing migratory systems, seasonal residency, and tourism, and of course are also very valuable to area residents for production and conservation purposes. In evaluating ecological impacts, watershed health and freshwater aquatic ecosystems, they are strongly influenced by terrestrial environments and climate conditions, which inform changes to the hydrological cycle. A recent study of the Upper Merrimack River watershed was particularly interesting because that area has experienced growth and is projected to continue experiencing growth. It showed that climate change is a more significant driver of water impairment than development, and land use and cover change can dampen or exacerbate these effects. So climate change will have a significant impact on your aquatic ecosystem services, mostly in the latter part of the century. And I think what's really interesting is that, studies that couple development with these terrestrial and aquatic impacts and climate change scenarios, although very difficult to model, can be really informative and can help regional planners with making important decisions about prioritizing conservation and ecosystem services.
So in looking at how climate migration could impact the social dynamic of the region, the two pillars we kind of dove into were public desire and social services. So starting with public desire, what we saw is that although there's a rhetoric of long-term residents kind of being pitted against new residents and being at odds with each other, research actually shows that the length of residence in a region has very little effect on the public desires of a resident. So a person's public desires are more impacted by their degree of involvement in a community rather than their length of residence. Residents with more community engagement tend to have a stronger desire for investment in social services, regardless of how long they've been there. Other dominant factors influencing public desire are the growth rate of the community and disparities in equity, such as wealth gaps between community members, inconsistent costs of living, and the state of relations between residents of different races. A key disparity affecting both public desire and social systems is gentrification in this study area. Within the last decade, affinity migrants from some of the most expensive urban housing markets are relocating to rural communities in New England. As a result, these communities are experiencing an overburdening demand for economic and cultural resources, spurred by widening gaps in social disparities. In these instances, many low-income residents are forced to leave communities they call home, and those who choose to stay are likely to experience weakened social capital and resilience. Gentrification also impacts school districts, leading to student displacement that weakens student success and socioeconomic segregation, in which the funding gap between schools in a region vary greatly. So in looking at the social systems most impacted by migration, we highlighted significant changes in housing needs, transportation services, and relocation services, the latter of which is unique to in-migration and consists of services such as job assistance and document processing. Next slide. So that's everything we've kind of, or I should say the key points of what we've done so far. The next steps coming up for our project is going to be coming up with some case studies of rural receiving communities and quote unquote climate havens that we could use as kind of examples of best practices in receiving in migration. We also are going to identify some resilient planning solutions, and along with that, suggest short-term and long-term planning focus areas, as well as we're hoping to create suitability criteria that will help in determining or identifying possible locations for growth versus conservation, and so forth. And with that, we're kind of switch the script and pop into just like a little discussion prompt. I know we might be a little tight for time, so please just cut us off when you need to continue on with your meeting. But for now, the kind of discussion question I'd like to reach out to all of you with is, what do you think makes the risks and opportunities of migration to the Upper Valley unique? This whole time we've kind of talked larger scale of the whole Connecticut River Valley, and I'd love to hear how this has made you guys think about your specific region.
Anybody have any comments? I only see part of the crowd that's on the meeting, so if someone wants to make a comment, please go for it. Well, Megan and so Joe,
No.
I appreciate. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think it makes us unique, but we have a serious housing shortage, especially of housing affordable to moderate. Anybody except Dartmouth professors.
Or physicians.
Yeah.
In some ways, because we have larger, more educated core big towns, it's in some ways it feels like we would accept different people because with Dartmouth we're used to seeing people of lots and lots of races around constantly, but because they're big towns and there's no housing, Tara's absolutely right, it's a problem for new people to come in.
And we don't have, sorry.
There's nowhere to live. I'm done.
And we don't, I mean, there's more affordable housing out in the rural areas, but we don't have rural public transportation. So all the housing studies we've done in the region, you know, really look at, there's a couple of main roads connecting the outlying towns in, and traffic issues on those roads are going to get more serious as growth continues in the outer circle.
Yeah, and with new development, they use the affordable housing sort of as a an opportunity to develop, but then they still put in a lot of really expensive housing as well, right? It's sort of that keyword that they put in for affordable housing to be able to develop, but they still put in the really, I think, unaffordable housing. But
Any other comments for Joe and Megan?
yeah, well, I'm more curious because you did say something about conservation, right? Where to develop, because we see that a lot too, right? It's even now in the comments, a lot of the more rural areas seem to get more development, even though that's, you know, I think it might be much better to keep people more in the cities, right? Instead of having to travel, keep them much closer to where they actually work or go to school or whatever it is, instead of spreading it out. So I think it becomes more important for conserving cultural heritage, right? Farmland is still cultural heritage. So.
And then Lebanon and White River complain about extra kids in school.
Yep.
So, I mean, it's a nice concept from a housing perspective, but it puts extra burden without the tax base to pay for the kids that are in school.
And in terms of opportunities, if we would do a hard opportunity assessment, you know, the Upper Valley is definitely an opportunity zone because we have education, we have jobs, we have services, but housing is missing, and there's a pretty strong, as I think maybe Eric was getting at, a little bit of a lip service to affordable housing, but when it comes to actually affordable housing, it's still a lot of NIMBYism.
Right.
Yep.
One of the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission, in conjunction with others, is about ready to publish a major work on housing. Olivia is one of the key authors in that, so we'll keep our eyes out for that and make sure it gets shared with those of us on the Connecticut River Joint Commission. Any other comments for Megan and Joe? Well, thank you very much for bringing your study to us tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you for
Ben?
all your hard work.
Thank you all.
Ben, did you have a comment? I see your, no, okay, all right.
Will your presentation be part of the May 19th
Yes.
meeting? Yeah, good.
And we're preparing a report as well, so I'm sure that you will have access to that. I would imagine.
Great. Cooper.
Good.
Thank you all.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.